Thank you for all those of you who've joined, and welcome to the Crush the Quo webinar series. The Crush the Quo is on a mission to fuel the change needed to create growth and elevate performance, whether that's as individuals or as businesses or leaders within our businesses. We want to see transformed mindsets, habits, and of course, we want to see habits of action or accomplishment. In today's webinar, we are going to be talking about winning the day one game. And the day one game, in a nutshell, is all customers have a preferred vendor list. And most of them will purchase off that list. And so in today's session, we are going to be hearing about how do we as vendors become day one worthy. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our guest presenter, Kunal Mehta. Kunal is an expert partner in B2B operations, sales and marketing with Bain Company, where he is working with executive teams to optimize go-to-market investments that accelerate growth using novel analytic approaches. So Kunal, welcome to our webinar series. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm going to just ask you to expand a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into our subject.
Sure, thank you. And good morning and good afternoon. It's good to be here with all the Crush the Quo listeners, most of them who I know. But again, my name is Kunal Mehta. I'm part of the commercial excellence practice at Bain. I typically work with CEOs, CROs, and management teams to drive go-to-market transformation and build go-to-market capabilities. Prior to Bain, I was an operator and actually did some real stuff, primarily across three areas: running operations, running and marketing orgs, and running strategy. Had a chance to do that at large companies like HP Software, VMware, and Infoblox. Prior to joining Bain, I spent a few years in private equity, and in that role, had a chance to work with roughly 30 companies on driving go-to-market value creation. And given the group, if you have questions, if you have a comment, you can certainly be part of the show today. So either throw that in the chat, come off mute. And Catherine, it's an absolute pleasure to be here today.
Amazing. All right, so Kunal, why don't we just kick straight off, and why don't we talk about, what do we mean by a day one list?
Sure. So what do we mean? Maybe we hop to the next slide. But I guess just to set the scene, Bain has done a lot of research jointly with Google on just B2B buying and how it's changed. And in that initial wave of research, I think there's stuff that everyone takes for granted now, and they include things like B2B buyers prefer to digitally nurture themselves before engaging with a company. Sales and marketing's the disconnect is even diverging in really big ways, and we can actually measure that chaos and cost as well. But we did another set of research where we said, hey, let's just dig into the buyer journey to find actual insight, and let's cut it by industry, let's cut it by different purchasing sizes and different B2B buyers. And so we did a whole bunch of research, but the most interesting was this concept of a day one list. So what is that actually? When you see it, it's very practical, but until you think about it and see the numbers, I think that's when it really hits you. But the day one list is a list of vendors that buyers have in mind before they actually begin the buying process. And in this study, which was published in the Harvard Business Review, what we found is 86% of buyers have a day one list. And most powerfully, no matter how thorough the buying process is, 92% of the buyers ended up buying off that day one list. And our research shows this is virtually universal. We found it to be true across industries, across buyer types, across transaction sizes, no matter how thorough the buying process was. And I'm sure you all have seen examples of that. I think the biggest takeaway for me is if you're not on the day one list, while companies typically add a vendor, the majority of the time they're buying off the day one list. So if your company's not in the moment that matters, it really does not matter. So that's kind of the key takeaway from this slide.
So what you're saying, Kunal, is that the day one list is the day customers decide to go to market for their supplier or vendor to solve their problem or make that purchase. That's day one. And that list already exists. Now, I'm surprised at one statistic here on this slide, and that is about the fact here that it says, I think, as much as 80% of those customers, despite having that preferred list, they still do additional vendor research?
They do. So they typically do additional vendor research and typically add, in most cases, one other vendor to the buying process. But if you're a vendor that gets added in on that additional buying process, again, the typical win rate is like in technology and software for that vendor that gets added is 7%. If you're on the original day one list, it's like 33%. So your win rate is materially higher by being on the day one list. But yes, typically one vendor, 1 to 2 vendors gets added in the research process, but they have low win rates.
But even if they get added in, 90% of buyers still go to their day one list of vendors.
That's right.
Interesting. So I guess the next question I have for you is, how do we as vendors, as suppliers, whatever we prefer to call ourselves, how do we get onto the day one list?
So how do you get on the day one list? So I think there's a few key takeaways. One is the B2B buyer, when they were at another company and they used you and they had a good experience, as they move to a new company, they already know you and they put you on that list. So how good is your company at identifying that? There's plenty of technologies. We used to use a company called Collective Eye that said, hey, if one of my champions, like Sue, as an example, moves from one company to another, how good am I at capturing that? I think the second is that the buyer receives strong recommendations from colleagues or a source that they trust. That's another certain example. How good are you? How good is your company at making sure you're cultivating that? And number 3, the buyer is just made aware of the vendor before they begin the buying process, and understood what the vendor did. So you may think, hey, look, I'm a major brand. Everyone knows me. So there's nothing to worry about with this day one list. However, the critical question is, do the right people know you? And do they know what you do today versus where you were in the past? And where you've been is often not relevant to the buyer.
So that's really quite revealing, and we'll have a look at a few more of those statistics in a moment. But I wanted to add just a comment here on this particular slide here that you have. I am quite surprised, but I suppose shouldn't be surprised. I'd love to know what the rest of you think, that you still need to have a digital presence, but that's just table stakes. Like, that is default, right? You should be doing that by default. But if you don't have a website or you're not involved online, is that going to then reduce your ability to get on the day one list?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I guess what can you practically do? A failure point that we consistently see is not having I'll kind of unpack this from top to bottom, but a failure point we typically see is you don't have a robust understanding of who you're targeting. Today, there's a lot of third-party data out there where you can know every single company, certainly out in the US and Europe, and to some degree in Asia. And you can pre-nurture, your best accounts. So companies that do not have a clear understanding at a company by company level about where the biggest opportunities for them, that is usually the case. When I was working at a Vista company and with TCV, 29 of 30 companies had a really poor understanding of how to prioritize accounts. So you always want to start with the basics. Do you have a bottoms up company level view of what the share of wallet is in each company? And then have you prioritized that list from, these are my A accounts where I have the best opportunities inside my base and also in the new logo universe. So number 1 is to really understand the accounts that matter. We call that propensity modeling. we built over 100 of those. I just, again, in those projects, just some key takeaways for your listeners is territories are always out of balance 100% of the time when we run those. And that could come in the form of sales reps chasing the wrong accounts that have no propensity to buy, to just hiring them in the wrong place. In half of our work, the segmentation's off. So we just wrapped up a case where they said enterprise accounts are ones with over 2,500 employees. What we ultimately found, it's much more nuanced, and we resegmented. Also, 100% of the time, marketing was not aligning towards the highest propensity accounts. And there's in marketing, there's kind of this law of big numbers. So if I take the USA as an example, there's 14 million accounts with under 1,000 employees. So if marketing is not super focused, they're just naturally going to generate a lot of noise in lower segments. So propensity modeling, number one, helps just maniacally focus on the accounts that you want to engage. I think if you move to
define what you mean by propensity.
Propensity is, so when I think of prioritizing accounts, what are the accounts with the highest likelihood to buy your product? And that's what I mean by propensity, both inside your customers that you already have, as well as new logos.
Okay, so it's the customers, the buyers that have the most likelihood to purchase our solutions at this time.
That's right. Now, if I move to the middle of the slide, just figuring, some basics. Figure out what your company's perception is. Certainly invest in digital marketing and a powerful website to drive, the understanding of who you are today and where you're going. If you're a seller, understand what accounts matter now and in the future. Certainly invest in longer term relationships before they begin their buying process. On websites, we find education probably has the most usage for, when buyers are, in the process of understanding who's out there for the problem that they have. Some of the best websites invest a lot of resource in educating buyers. The second thing is to make your clients massively successful. So, again, that is, when I was a seller, there was probably two golden outcomes. When a sales reps, when I found a prospect and I introduced them to a client that solved the problem, that was almost 100% close rate. If I got a buyer to our executive briefing center, or now more so virtual executive briefing center, where I have my best and brightest working them, it had an incredibly high close rate. So again, how can you scale some of those learnings into equipping your, driving more of a recommendation engine? So again, those are a couple practical ways. I think from a marketing perspective, certainly playing more of a longer game is important. And I think as we get to the bottom of slide 4, we certainly have some data on the number of buyers involved in deals, which I think your listeners will find eye-opening as well.
That'll be interesting when we get to the discussion on the buyers, the journey, the buyers, what they go through. I'm curious though, what are the other sources that buyers go to do research? You mentioned previous experience. What are the other sources?
I think that's a good segue to the next slide. So if I look at our research, Catherine, you're welcome to put on your website or send out to everyone here. I'll send you the links to that. But obviously, what's on the company's vendor list matters. But again, experience working with the tool or the software solution previously is critically important. The vendor website is again critically important. Recommendations from a colleague. Again, how a lot of companies we work with are not good at building the machinery to do that. We just worked with a vendor. This is a $5 billion company with tens of thousands of clients. They didn't have one case study, either blinded or real, to help drive that recommendation engine. I know as we look at influencers, blogs, basically third-party validation, that becomes important. I think the other surprising thing is if you're doing paid advertising, I was surprised at some of the older world stuff being at the top, like magazines and newspapers. People still read those.
Surprising.
But again, these are just, again, we'll share the deck, the broader deck with all your listeners here as well.
So this is quite an interesting list here. I'd be curious for the folks that are online as you read through this list, is there anything that pops out to you, anything that's a surprise to you? What are your thoughts? I'm assuming this research has been done quite recently, right, Kunal?
Yeah, this research was done it's been roughly a year, but we repeat it. We've been repeating it every year for multiple years.
So this is post-COVID, because if I see business events there, that's quite high up. Is that face-to-face conferences,
That's right.
meetings, executive breakfasts, things like that?
That's right. And I think the other thing you'll find in this research, and I'll also put it in the appendix here, is the role of the rep. It's diminishing almost year over year. And in this study, you'll find the role of the rep. I mean, I think 1 in 4 people didn't even contact a rep till they're almost ready to buy. I think in most cases, the rep doesn't even get involved till 75% of the journey is done. So the role of the rep is really changing.
If you could share that information, that would be really, really helpful. What we find in our geography, we've also got some regulatory and there's legislation in place that kind of dictates to organizations to a degree how they need to go about sourcing vendors, which leaves us with a narrow gap of opportunity. So what may happen is you get into one particular stakeholder, but then because of the regulatory environment, there are so many stakeholders involved in that one deal that the process takes very long. There's buyer fatigue, all of those things that I know you're familiar with. So what I'd really like to know is what I'm hanging on for is the next part. Is okay, well, how do we go from here to getting that meeting and then creating some sort of buyer consensus that gives us a real opportunity to get listed?
Yeah, Shelley, that's a great observation. Just, when Catherine did the intro, she talked about novel analytics. I'll share a quick one. So this is a different research study, but we looked at how do we know if an opportunity has an 80% chance to close? And we branded that what we call 3-2-1. So 3 is, so if I take Infoblox as an example, and we were selling to the networking department, if we had a relationship in networking, a relationship in security, a relationship with procurement, that would be the 3. If we had 2 contacts in each, and we considered a contact an engaged contact. So Shelley, if I text you and you text me back, that would be an engaged contact. And then 1 champion, if I achieved 3-2-1, that opportunity had an 80% chance to close. And we found that across a research set of 50 portfolio companies. So I think your insight on building a shared vision of success is critically important because of the number of people involved in the buying process. And I think we have some data on another slide that just shows how rapidly that number is going up.
Quite surprising.
Very quickly, when you say 1 champion, do you mean 1 champion in each of those 3 buying teams?
1 champion for
overall
solution, and that's the one that's actually you're equipping to internally sell.
Yes, and I think I have some information on that. So if anyone would like to get it, just hit me up via email and we can share that with you. So so this list was a very interesting list. I thought it was very revealing. I do think there are geographical challenges, like Shelley has mentioned, under certain legislative requirements. Vendors have to have a certain listing, a certain BEE status in South Africa, which means that vendor list becomes a little bit more challenging, right, Shelley? And you're kind of on that list or you're not already. But then once you're on that list, there's still going to be a preferred set of suppliers, I guess.
The good news in our environment, Catherine, is once you're on the list, and that's how Kunal opened up, once you're on the list, your chances of getting the repeat business are really good if you're nurturing the relationship. So there is a plus side to it.
Exactly. Yeah. And then my last comment or question to you, Kunal, before we carry on, is on the vendor websites, which I'm quite surprised is so high on the list here. I'm assuming, number one, you have to have a vendor website. If you have no vendor website, do they just dismiss you straight away? Are there special criteria? So if I'm thinking of, bigger B2B companies and your website is very interactive, you have chatbots, you have AI things, you have downloadables. Is that what they're looking for on their websites, or is it just the fact that you have one?
No, I think when somebody is kind of in discovery mode, we would call that awareness. Like, when they come onto your website, over half of the companies already have an issue with a solution that's not meeting their need. So they know they have a need. They're looking for who solves that need. So that's why the education piece during that I would call it the awareness phase becomes so important. So I think that's critical. Once they've discovered, once they're aware of the solutions that are out there, then they're looking at who solves those, and then they're narrowing down their list. Okay. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you. All right, let's talk a little bit about the internal buying journey. What does this process look like internally for the buyers? What is their day one journey?
Yeah, should we maybe we should hop to the next slide here. There you go. Okay. I think one of the most interesting aspects of this slide, if we look at the awareness phases, is how many people are involved in a deal. When we did this research, I referenced the Google research. We were seeing like 8 to 9 people at that time involved in a deal. The number in our survey is jumping to over 16, with 3 approvers and 9 to 10 influencers. Which just, again, to Shelley's point, how much work do you need to do to build a shocking success? Yeah.
I mean, for so many years, we've been looking at the Forrester or the Gartner research that says it's been average 8 or 9 people for a buying decision. You're saying here it's going as high as 16, 17 on the buying committee plus additional influencers. That's shocking.
That's right. With more, approvers involved.
Oh, approvers on top of that.
That's right. That's right.
And how do they figure sales is becoming less relevant?
Well, this is all happening during before they even, a lot of the research because buyers like to self-discover, they're doing a lot of their own work as committees before they've even engaged the rep. They're coming in extremely educated about what they want before a rep is even involved.
And this number is a Bain number, right? This is Bain research.
Yeah, this is from the Bain research, but it's part of that's part of the work that was published in the Harvard Business Review as well. So it's been vetted by other parties.
Okay, so the question in the chat, it comes from Harvard Business and Bain. So that's quite a serious number. So as sellers, that tells me as sellers, we have to do a better job getting in front of the buying journey, so that they're not just picking up the phone when they're 75% of the way through. And Kunal, I'm just curious, in your research or in the HBR research, did they establish what's the longest part of the buying journey? The statistics I've seen say it's that education awareness phase that takes the longest. Is that what your research shows?
Yeah, I think you'll see awareness, discovery, and consideration. Those are so if I take an enterprise deal with an average, this is like the average. We built this for an average sales price of $100,000, right? Okay. We have different journeys at different segments as well, but they're largely similar. But in this process, awareness and discovery are the longest. Consideration is where you're engaging with the rep and going deep into product features, and then the decision process is just getting through the internal. You've decided on a vendor. It's the negotiation. It's all of that. But you've already chosen at that point.
So as sellers need to do a much better job of getting in front of that awareness process before the buyers even start.
That's right. So if they're, as I look at building a propensity model and ones with the highest propensity to buy, I definitely want to be early on in terms of driving awareness as a seller, certainly partnering with marketing as well, and using the entire go-to-market apparatus to drive awareness in those high propensity accounts. When we
have a look at the discovery phase.
Yeah, well, let's look at the discovery phase. One thing I'll say on that propensity side, Catherine, if it's done well, what we found over those 100 projects is 80. So at the end of a project like that, you get A accounts, B accounts, and C accounts. What we found over and over again is that 86% of the closed won ultimately come from A accounts. We also found in these projects that 22% of the time, A accounts had no sales rep assigned. So again, that's,
That's shocking.
It's critically important to drive focus on accounts with the highest
That is
propensity.
shocking. Despite, I'm really, really shocked to hear that. And I'm curious here, as 25% of buyers don't have a day one list. That's another big opportunity, right?
That is another big opportunity for sure. As we unpack the discovery phase, the most important resources that were very high value outside of the vendor website was third-party attribution and industry reviews. And for offline, the demos and the trials were critically important. In the past, I'll go back to a past example. As a Tableau customer, they were probably one of the best at using community. When you went to a user group, they had the only people presenting in a user group were customers, and they were just huge fans of Tableau. They would bring all their friends there, and they built this grassroots through a community-based approach to drive how incredible Tableau was. They were presenting tons of different use cases. So when I look at folks like Sue on the phone, how can they use things like community here again to expand the number of people that their customers are touching as well here. And customers love presenting at community groups.
Oh, do they?
They love it, yeah, because it showcases their thought leadership, especially if they're building not really novel things. And in Tableau, they were presenting things like not only propensity models, which is one area, certainly I learned how to build propensity. It piqued my interest, but any novel use case on like, how do I drive improvements in customer loyalty to where I can drive improvement in conversion rates across the sales pipeline. People loved showcasing their thought leadership in those areas. This is at Tableau.
What about the just consideration phase?
I think in the consideration phase, the thing that shocked me, 1 in 4 buyers had not even engaged a rep. People really want to self-discover. There's other research that shows that the primary value of the sales rep was overwhelmingly to process the deal. But it's at this point where the sales rep is most crucial and can deliver the most value to tip the scales and in the favor of their software solution.
And then we have the decision phase. And folks, if you have questions or comments on this slide, I'd love to hear what you're thinking as you see these statistics.
Yeah, again, I mean, the biggest takeaway again for software and tech is that 93% of buyers choose from the day one list. Over half, I would say, wanted to, and this was an average transaction size of 100,000, but over half the people surveyed wanted to complete the transaction online, despite having other options. Probably what's missing is is how incredibly important it is to make your customers massively successful as well, because that, that just cements in the buyer's mind that there's a lot of people that have solved this problem already.
Any surprises?
I'm just surprised, as you already commented, Catherine, on how the stats have changed over the last couple of years.
Yes. Kunal, do you think, did COVID have an impact on those numbers? This buying committee number, we're all quite sort of surprised about. Sorry.
Yeah.
Quite surprised about COVID.
I can go back to the previous, pre-COVID and pull up this slide for you and see. We can look at it. We can stare at it together and see what changed.
There, that would be good.
Yeah, I'm sure we do, because we've been running this for a few years here.
Because that is a big jump. That is a big jump. And I'm also curious here with this 53% of buyers purchase directly from the vendor via e-commerce channels. So they basically purchase online.
That's right. And this is for $100,000.
$100,000 property. That's
it tells you how critically important how important it is to be digitally discoverable, and then how important it is to serve up, how important content becomes and when to serve it up.
Question in the chat for you, Kunal. What might the impact of increased volume of information be that we can expect of AI?
Just let me clarify. What I mean by that is, I suspect and Kunal, tell me if you agree or disagree with this, or if there's any data, that'd be even better to know. But with the proliferation of information, we're now heading towards another productivity boom, but we still have the same prefrontal cortex and limited mental capacity. Do you think that that's part of what's happening here, that there's a greater effort and focus on filtering to preserve the energy and decision-making capabilities of the execs? And if so, what should we be preparing ourselves for?
Yeah, so we have, so Bain right now has 100 projects roughly going on with AI. And we have a partnership with a company called OpenAI, which is the ChatGPT. They produced like incredibly novel application. But what we found, Shelley, is that ChatGPT and other AI tools incredibly personalize the experience. So we just wrapped up a project. This is a public project at Carrefour, where on the B2C side, we can incredibly tailor the shopper's experience. But if you extend that to someone coming in from the B2B side, if I just take, this is a real example where if a lead comes in and it's a highly qualified account, as in my email response, I have the segment I have the industry, I have the employee size, I have the revenue of that, I have the title, I have a bunch of case studies in my own repository. So ChatGPT will take all of that information and help you kind of customize a very targeted email response back to a lead or a form fill that's coming in. So it's not just the standard cadence anymore. I think the most sophisticated companies are tailoring their cadence in really personalized ways, and then serving up cases that are more tailored to what that buyer would need. So I find AI to narrow and highly personalize the content that the actual buyer is getting versus exploding it into too much.
But that answers the question, Shelley.
Yes, it'll be that's encouraging. I'm 100% convinced that greater personalization and greater context will bring us better sales results. It remains to be seen whether or not being hyper, and an emphasis on hyper responsive, where there is an incredible speed of responsiveness, what the impact of that will be, given the fact that, and you've just mentioned how many projects you're involved with at Bain, and many of our customers are in similar scenarios. They've got 30 projects on the go, and now we're moving the complexity. Yes, it's personalized, but it's happening much faster.
Yeah, and maybe Catherine, for a future webinar, we can see if we can get you a generative AI person, and they can talk about like the most practical use cases companies are rolling out today.
That'd be good to see. Yes, please. So Kunal, as we head towards the close, what should we as vendors do now? I'm sure there's a lot that we should and could be doing, but what would be the next one, two, or three things that you would suggest we do now?
Yeah, so I mean, what I did on the next slide is basically provide a diagnostic set of questions. So what are you doing to ensure your customers are your best advocates? Again, I talked about the example that I just rolled out of, where we had a $5 billion company, tens of thousands of customers. They didn't have one case study. Over time, though, this marketing team was generating 14% of the close won, which is not great, but they were only 3% of the total spent on go-to-market. So imagine what they could do with the right investment, and they could certainly lower their cost of acquisition. So I'd say number one is, what are you doing to ensure your customers are the best advocates? How are you prioritizing which accounts to pursue? With digital, it's not just the right resources. Another thing that we see is, like, do you have a test and learn plan? How do you know your landing pages are optimized? How do you know your email is optimized? How do you know your LinkedIn, your retargeting efforts are optimized? There are ways to test and learn those at very low cost. A test could be like $250, but digital is so expensive. If you're not putting into place these test and learn plans, you can overspend in digital and get no result. So one of the things we suggest are these test and learn plans as you're just beginning your digital journey. So you can see, like, hey, if I have all these leads and nothing happening, if I retarget them, how should I do it in LinkedIn, and what works versus what doesn't work? Once you figure out what's working, you can pour a lot more rocket fuel into that. So again, those are again, this, we'll send out the deck, but these are a list of kind of some of the diagnostic questions that we look at.
Okay, and so, in terms of, pipeline building, next steps, what is the sort of the strongest use case that you want to highlight to us?
Man, I'm super glad you brought that up, because like once you identify your right accounts, what's the most efficient way to go after those accounts? And I think when you and others talk about sales plays, I think you actually have some really good examples on what's the most efficient way to go after prospects or customers that have the highest propensity to buy. And it might make sense for you to talk about an example, and I'm happy to do the same here as well.
So before I talk, are you saying that getting your go-to-market focus and execution is so crucial in terms of getting onto that day one list? Are you saying that's one of the most, or not one of the most, but a extremely important task that we should all be doing?
Yeah, so step one is like prioritize accounts, and that's going to help you balance territories, get your segmentation correct, set your targets or set your quotas correctly, and then focus marketing. Step two is like, once I understand which accounts to focus on, what is the most efficient way to build pipeline in those accounts? So in my experience, sales plays is the most efficient way to drive pipeline and build strong connective tissue between sales and marketing.
Well, that's the key thing there, the connective tissue between sales and marketing. And so you were asking a little bit about, what we do, and that's one of the most important things to get it right, to make sure your sales plays are going to be successful. And that is to have those integrated marketing selling efforts, integration between marketing and sales. Too many organizations, they operate completely independently. One doesn't know what the other one's doing, and worse than that, one thinks they're doing a great job and the other one doesn't know what they're doing. So integrating them, and then bringing in your product marketing as well, bringing in your company leadership team, and other experts into the process too. That's a critical ingredient to running a successful sales play. And then that prioritization, identifying the messaging, identifying the problems you're solving and the solutions you're then going to attach to those problems, and then going to market with that jointly. So marketing goes out and does things, and then sales goes out and does things too. And then you track and you monitor and you repeat that process multiple times over, it could be a month, a quarter, a year. Every company prioritizes it differently.
Yeah, and one thing I would have, I was the CMO at a company called Oversight. And prior to this sales play systems, our teams were generating like 5 meetings a week. And I think as we started to roll out things like this, I think on the very first sales play, we generated like 30 in the first day, with real pipeline and real close won. So again, once you get everyone focused on the right accounts, these sales plays, whether it's new logo or cross-selling or win backs or cross-selling when the renewal happens, you can build your repository of sales plays that work, and then as you build those repository, they're kind of evergreen. You can keep using them. That's good to know.
All right, thank you all for joining us today. I hope you found the session insightful and informative, with some valuable new perspectives on the day one list and how we get onto the day one list. And I hope that the information will empower you to go out there and help your customers do this, or indeed do it for yourself. So thank you all for your participation. And also thank you so much, Kunal, for joining us and giving us your time. If there are further questions, don't hesitate to reach out to our team, and we will share the slide deck with you. For all of those of you that joined today, we will share the slide deck with you. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.